So as we move towards the facts, Brian, you want to list those out for us before we dive into each and every one of them?
Sure. So the 5 facts altogether. First, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Second, that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them.
Mm-hmm.
Third, the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. Fourth, the skeptic James, the half-brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed.
Uh-huh.
And 5, the tomb was empty.
Okay. No miracles there so far.
Right.
Nothing
These are pretty
supernatural.
straightforward claims, right? There's nothing, we're not appealing to any miracles up front, assuming anything supernatural up front. Nothing here that anyone should really have a problem with just looking at the singular facts themselves.
Yeah.
Like notice number 2, it says Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them, not that he did rise and appear to them.
Right. Okay.
So that's all we're claiming there.
Mm-hmm.
Like the last one, the tomb was found empty. It doesn't say how, right?
Yep.
Could leave it open to a number of naturalistic explanations without appealing to miracles.
Okay.
So
Perfect.
yeah. So the first one, we could just dive right into these and start looking at the historical support for them. The first one, that Jesus died by crucifixion. There's actually at least nine independent sources for this, both Christian and non-Christian sources. So the first 4 are all 4 Gospels.
Right.
And remember, we're taking these as independent sources, not as one clumped together because we've compiled them into a single book today.
Right.
That didn't happen for a couple hundred years
Right.
after, right? Second, Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, mentions the crucifixion. Tacitus, the great Roman historian, mentions the crucifixion. Lucian of Samosata, he was a Greek satirist. He mentions not the crucifixion specifically as far as the method, but the death of Jesus, how the Jews had him put to death. Mara bar Serapion, a Stoic philosopher. The only writing we have of his is a letter that he wrote to his son from prison, and he mentions again the death of Jesus. And then in the Jewish Talmud, that talks about the Yeshua, Jesus, being hanged, which was another term for hanging on a tree, crucifixion. And so these are all independent sources from both Christian and non-Christian.
Yeah, well-rounded, Jewish, Greek, Roman. I mean,
right.
About
as good as you could ask for, and going, within the same lifetimes of when this event, supposedly took place.
Yeah, this isn't hand-me-down at this point. This is
right.
First generation.
Yeah, several of these are the Gospels, Josephus, even Tacitus is just he was born shortly after the event, but lived contemporary with many people that would have been alive for this. And this is really unusual for historical events. We're pretty happy if we can get within a few hundred years.
Seriously.
A lot of times, just find some generally trustworthy historian who's writing about these things that may or may not have good information available to them. John Dominic Crossan is a historian who is the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar, a pretty liberal group that generally gets together and determines what Jesus didn't do and what Jesus didn't say, things like that. He says that, this is a quote from him, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. So that's a pretty strong statement. As far as historical evidence is concerned, this is very well attested. The second, that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. This became the central message of the apostles. They were transformed from fearful doubters, running for their lives to
literally
and hiding, to bold proclaimers of Jesus, to the point of being willing to suffer and even give their lives for this message. And we can see this through 2 lines of evidence. They claimed it and they believed it. So first of all, they claimed it. We see in Paul's writings that he claims to have known at least the 3 big apostles, Peter, James, and John, right? And to have known them personally. The book of Acts and other Christian writings support this, that Paul had interactions with them.
Yeah. Okay.
And in 1 Corinthians 15, which we read part of, he says that both he and they preach the resurrection.
Okay.
And remember, we're considering the writings of Paul as an early independent source from the gospel accounts, not as inspired scripture. And the majority of Paul's letters are some of the most well accepted among critical scholars as far as the New Testament documents, generally seen to be the most historically reliable. They attribute them to Paul, dated very early, some of the earliest sources available.
Wow.
So some of these letters were written and being circulated before the Gospels, many of the Gospels were even written and known. So this is a very early source. Second, through oral tradition. You have in 1 Corinthians 15, at the beginning of the chapter, what looks to be an early creed of the church that Paul quotes here. Creeds are intended to present important material in a format that is friendly to memorization and retention. Many people will be familiar with a lot of the early creeds of the church. And they tend to be kind of chant-like, so they're easy to remember.
Contemporary worship songs or some of them, like the Apostles' Creed, that kind of
you can like turn those into songs easily.
Of sorts.
Right. So Paul quotes an early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 5. He says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." And this is where it looks like the creed starts. "That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles." And then it looks like he kind of tacks this on. "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So he includes himself in this list of appearances following this important message of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So if Paul wrote this in this letter and quotes this early creed, and this letter itself is a very early source, right? Then this creed must be even earlier. And you think of a teaching to be so important, and circulated enough that it's developed into a creed. It means that, we're not talking just a couple of years before Paul wrote it. This is something that was probably taught regularly and then took this form of a creed. And so it looks like this goes back to possibly within even a few years of the crucifixion and death and resurrection. So secondly, the sermon summaries that we find in the Bible, particularly the book of Acts. We see people like Peter giving sermons. Remember, there's no video, there's no audio recording. And so these sermons were probably not recorded immediately. Most likely there weren't scribes there writing word for word down. What most likely happened is that these sermons were preached repeatedly and enough that this content was very well known. And the important points of the message were taken and recorded for us. And so we see probably summaries of the actual sermons that were given in the book of Acts that hits all the main points. And so if that's what was happening, then again, this predates when they were actually written down, in these records like the book of Acts.
Like Peter's message in Acts 2 kind of ends with this Jesus whom you crucified. Like, not only is he claiming it, but it seems as if it was widely accepted enough that these Jews who are visiting Jerusalem from all over practically the known world, like, oh yeah, this is a common fact. We all agree to this. Even if we don't agree necessarily that Jesus was a Messiah, we all agree that he was crucified.
Yeah. These people that he was speaking to would have known about these events for sure. And then we see not only in oral tradition, but in written tradition, we have all four Gospels that were written during the first century, attest to the resurrection of Jesus. Again, four independent sources from each other. We see this in the Apostolic Fathers. And these are the men who succeeded the apostles, kind of their disciples who carried on their teaching and took positions in church leadership. We see the Clement of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, He wrote a letter to the Corinthians around 95 AD, in which he stated that the apostles had assurance through the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay.
Irenaeus, about 185 AD, says that he personally knew the apostles and that he carried on their message.
Okay.
Tertullian, around 200 AD, says that according to church records, Clement was appointed by Peter, kind of verifying back to Clement making this claim about what the apostles taught. And then Polycarp, he was supposedly appointed bishop of Smyrna by the apostle John.
Okay.
He was one of his disciples, and he wrote to Philippi around 110 AD and mentions the resurrection 5 times as this message that was probably passed down from his teachers, from the apostles.
Yeah. Okay.
So we see this tradition going all the way back, both oral and written tradition that shows that this was the consistent message of the apostles. This is what they were teaching. This is what they were claiming happened.
Yeah. Okay. That seems pretty ironclad. Historically, they claimed it. I mean, we
Right.
can prove that. Multiple sources, secular, Jewish, Roman, Greek, Christian, they claimed it.
Right.
All right. So what's next after that?
So they believed it. And
Okay,
that's
kind of a
the
big
thing,
difference.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
right. They could be claiming this and they could be making it all up,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
personal gain or whatever.
Yeah.
And, we'll look at that. But the first line of evidence that they believed it is they were willing to suffer.
Okay.
So for this claim, for their beliefs, they were willing to suffer, and many of them went to their deaths for this.
Yeah. Which is important, and we'll get to, but of, the daily news, we could probably not have to dig too far down to see people of any number of religions suffering for their religious beliefs. And so what makes this different, that the early apostolic fathers and the disciples in particular, that they suffered for their faith? How does that prove to us that they really believed it?
Right. That's a good question, because someone willing to die for their beliefs today, that doesn't mean their belief is true, right? They could be sincerely mistaken about it. So I think the important difference is that these men and women were in a position to know whether or not it was true.
Yeah,
so they're claiming that an event happened in, they're contemporary with the event. They live in the same region. And so if they were just mistaken about it, or if they weren't sure, they could go and check. They could go and see if these things were true. They could go to the tomb and see, is there still a body there? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think a good way to look at it is that, I could tell you, hey, I just heard about this car bomb that went off in London and took out 4 city blocks.
Okay.
And, you might believe me. I mean, how would you know? I mean, you could try to look it up in the internet. Maybe just because you didn't find information doesn't mean that, it didn't happen, right? But if I told you a car bomb went off and took out 4 city blocks in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, you'd probably be a little more skeptical about it because you haven't heard about it, and you could always go down and check.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's the difference. These men and women were in a position to know whether or not it was true.
Okay.
And it's very doubtful that all of them would be willing to suffer, and many of them die for what they knew to be a lie. So you might suffer and die for what you think was true, but were mistaken about, but not something that you knew to be a lie.
So if there was some grand conspiracy and these now 11 disciples, they want to be popular, they want to be influential, they want to be wealthy because they've created this lie, that's one thing. But for universally, without exception, literally all of them willing to suffer and most of them to die for this, that's pretty exceptional. Conspirators don't do that without exceptions, or people folding under pressure, or with bodily harm being threatened towards them.
Yeah, even if you thought maybe they started this out thinking that they could, get some monetary gain or fame from this, the fact that we know they didn't.
Yeah, it went in the exact opposite direction.
Right. As soon as it started going in that direction, they'd be like, oh, okay, wait, I was just kidding, especially after, 1 or 2 of them started to be persecuted and put into prison and killed. They're like, I'm out. That conspiracy most likely would not hold. And we have evidence that they did suffer, and several of them died. So here's some of the evidence. We see it in the book of Acts.
All over.
Talks about their suffering. Clement of Rome, again, in 1 Clement chapter 5, Polycarp in his letter to the Philippians, Ignatius, who was a friend of Polycarp, recorded their willingness to suffer for their beliefs. Dionysius of Corinth, we see, we don't have any of his writings, but he's quoted in Eusebius, who wrote a history of the early church in around 300, 350 AD. He mentions this, and we see this also in Tertullian and Origen. So many sources talk about their suffering and their persecution, being physically beaten, thrown into prison, driven into exile, and some of them put to death. So the third fact, the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. Most people will be familiar with Saul of Tarsus, who went from being a skeptic who believed it was God's will for him to hunt down Christians, to persecute the church, to bring them to justice. Something happened to him that made him go from that to being one of the most influential members and promoters of Christianity.
Absolutely.
And so something dramatic that has to be accounted for. This change has to be accounted for somehow.
I mean, it was literally his job to hunt down, imprison, and or kill these believers. I mean, we see him like nodding his approval and participating in the stoning of Stephen, the first known martyr according to Scripture. That's a radical transformation for not only, I mean, to claim Saul of Tarsus as a skeptic is putting it pretty mildly. And so for him to suddenly turn into a champion of the way of this Christianity is something worth taking a close look at.
Right. Something has to account for that, just psychologically. I mean, we know enough about human nature to know that these deeply ingrained, religious beliefs that you've held from birth that drives you on to this radical lifestyle, like to just have a dramatic change, something must have happened. And we know about Paul's conversion from his own writings. He tells us about this. And he says that it was due to his encounter with the risen Jesus. This is in his words, his testimony of explaining this conversion experience. We see this in 1 Corinthians, in Galatians, and Philippians, all books that Paul wrote. We see it in the book of Acts, recorded for us, which looks like it was written by someone who was a companion with Paul.
Absolutely.
For
lots of we type of language pronouns.
And according to Paul in Galatians, it says that this was known by the early Christians in Judea. You think about it, you live in the area, you're a Christian who's being persecuted, and that you have this main guy that's going around hunting people down, Inquisition style. And then you hear that all of a sudden he's one of us.
He's a preacher now.
They're gonna probably know about that. And Paul mentions that there's a lot of people there that they know that this happened. We have strong evidence that he was not intentionally lying about it because of his suffering and martyrdom. We see this in Paul's own writings in the book of Acts. Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, all of these guys mention Paul's sufferings, and that he would eventually be put to death, under Nero of Rome. We see this quoted in Eusebius, is Dionysius of Corinth and Origen. So the fourth fact, the skeptic James, the half-brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. So again, we have another conversion experience, and we get to see a little bit of his life and his reaction to Jesus in the Gospels, that his brothers kind of mocked him. And I think that's understandable. I mean, you think about, like, how hard would it be to believe that your brother was God, right?
Seriously, like, I grew up with you, hold on.
Right, and some people might say, well, he was perfect. Well, that would just make you hate him even more,
Seriously,
You're always getting in trouble, you try to blame it on Jesus, and nobody ever believes you because he never does anything wrong. And it kind of gives whole new meaning to what would Jesus do. I mean, imagine your parents like, Jesus wouldn't act that way. Why can't you be more like Jesus,
James.
So you can see why he wouldn't be real fond of Jesus. I think that's a believable scenario. So that's all we see of him in the Gospels, right? And then we get into this early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul reports an appearance of the risen Jesus to James. And then the next time we see James is in the book of Acts, when he's actually the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So he went from mocking Jesus, not being one of his followers, making fun of, his supposedly performing miracles, to now the leader, the main leader of the church in Jerusalem, where you even have the apostles there, like Peter, following his leadership. So that's a pretty dramatic change as well.
Yeah. If very close eyewitness to the whole life of Jesus isn't enough, to exposure to the teachings of Jesus isn't enough, to even the miracles that are recorded in the Gospels isn't enough, something greater than the life, than the teaching, than these miracles that benefited others, something greater than those must have occurred that would make James suddenly think, oh, okay, now this is enough evidence to make me believe. Like something transformed his thoughts.
Right. Yeah. And keep in mind, as we're going through these facts, these are not things that we're pulling from Scripture because we believe they're inspired and all true, right? Obviously, everything we've said here, any Christian who believes in the reliability and truthfulness of the Bible would agree with all of these points. But even skeptical scholars see enough historical corroboration to these events that they agree, yes, James, who was a doubter, was a skeptic, changed and became an influential leader. Same with Paul. So we see also his martyrdom, which again just shows us the genuineness of his conversion. Josephus, in his Antiquities, mentions the martyrdom of James. Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria, I don't know if I pronounced those right, but
it sounded great.
Both of those quoted in Eusebius.
Okay. And so from the critical point of view, okay, these were historical figures. There was a Saul from Tarsus. We can prove that he existed. Okay, there's this James, the son of Mary and Joseph. Thus, he's called the half-brother. He existed, but okay, these people were pretty close to Jesus. Perhaps they were his disciples. So they're so close to the source that they would want Jesus to have resurrected because they could probably put together that Jesus said he would. There seems as if they could have had mixed motivations, bias towards Jesus to do this. What else can we look at as far as evidence?
Yeah, I think that you could probably, potentially say that about the disciples, and that's why the last two facts with Paul or Saul of Tarsus and James are kind of special cases, because these are people that weren't expecting
they didn't want Jesus to rise from the dead.
Especially Paul. They didn't believe that Jesus was God's, special chosen son, the Messiah to lead Israel. They weren't expecting him to deliver their people. They were against him. So something happened that changed their minds, and that's so there was no prior expectation that would explain their behavior after that.
So the disciples would have had mixed motivation, obviously. Whether they gained from it or just sincerely wanted to believe it is one thing. But for Saul, for James to be like, nope, never believed it while Jesus was alive, adamantly opposed even after the resurrection, but something happened to even these hardcore skeptics. And so it seems like they're particularly good persons to look at.
And then the last fact, the tomb was found empty. So there are three arguments that we're going to look at, and these are out of about 23 given by critical scholars as evidence for the empty tomb.
And before we get into these, we're not saying anything miraculous here either. We're just, hey, there was a tomb, then it was empty. So not necessarily a miracle at this point.
And in addition to the crucifixion and the empty tomb, like there's good evidence that Jesus's body wasn't treated like any other Roman crucifixion victim and just tossed aside into a mass burial site where his body could decompose. That he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And there's some cultural background that explains why that would be the case too, because this happened right before the Passover, and by law, they had to keep the land pure, This is part of the Old Testament law, the Jewish law, that the land had to be purified for this ritual, and this included the burial and taking care of dead bodies in the land. And if there was no one to do that, that duty fell on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council themselves, to make sure it was taken care of, because they were ultimately responsible for the land of Israel, to make sure that it was pure and they were ready to observe the Passover. Which explains why you have this prominent member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, taking in Jesus and putting him in his own tomb. And that was temporary too. He wasn't giving anything up, you know, like in his family tomb.
Benevolent man, necessarily.
Necessarily, right, because the way they did it, they would leave a body in a tomb for, you know, a couple of years until it completely decomposed. They would gather the bones and put them in an ossuary or a bone box, and then put those somewhere. So, you know, Joseph Joseph of Arimathea wasn't necessarily giving up his family tomb for life, right? It's just like, it's my, you know, my job, in my job description, to make sure the land is pure. You know, I'll take care of the body, because the disciples are all hiding and scared and, you know, not there to do it. But yeah, there's nothing, we're not assuming any kind of explanation in the tomb being empty there, right? It was found empty a few days later. What's the possible explanations
Why
of
could
that?
be?
Right. So first of all, the Jerusalem factor. The resurrection was publicly preached in Jerusalem, where he was executed and buried, not in Rome or somewhere else. Initially, it was like right where it happened. And so if the body was still there, that message wouldn't have been able to get off the ground.
I mean, this isn't like a long, long time ago in a galaxy far away. Like in this town, days ago, this thing happened. And if anyone was doubting whether or not that was true, they could have gone to the tomb and said, well, look, here's the body right here. What do you mean he rose from the dead? You know? Second, enemy attestation. There's only one early opposing theory that was offered by Jesus' enemies that we know of, and that's that the disciples stole the body. And when we look at the explanations, you know, pretty soon here, we'll see this is one of them that was offered. So even though an empty tomb isn't mentioned, that would imply that the body was not available, right? If the disciples stole the body, that means the body wasn't there where it was supposed to be. And we see this in Matthew chapter 28. This is the account. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So this is the account. There was a guard posted at the tomb, right? It was their job to make sure that nothing happened to the body, because they're like, hey, they're claiming some weird stuff. Let's make sure nothing comes of this. And then the body was gone. These guards, instead of going to their commander, which is understandable because they probably would have been put to death for failing at their job, they went to the chief priests. And the priests, they didn't want this word to get out. So they're like, if anyone asks, just say somebody stole the body. We'll make sure you don't get in trouble. And the original spin doctors.
So this is a much more powerful testimony coming from his enemies, right? That there's some explanation needed to happen for why the body was missing than if it were to come from his friends, you know, his followers saying the tomb was empty. So we see this also in Justin Martyr, Tertullian, as well as Matthew there. And then the testimony of women. So we know from the gospel accounts that women were the first ones to come and find the tomb empty, right? If someone was concocting a story in order to deceive others, they wouldn't include things in their story that would hurt its credibility. And in all four gospels, women were listed as the primary and first witnesses of the resurrection, of the empty tomb and then the resurrection. In fact, in Matthew and Mark, they were the only witnesses listed. And this is significant because in both Jewish and Roman culture in those days, women were lowly esteemed and their testimony was questionable.
I've heard not even admissible in court, in legal proceedings.
I've got a few quotes here. A couple from the Talmud, Jewish writings. Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women. The world cannot exist without males and without females. Happy is he whose children are males, and woe to him whose children are females. Not a very high view of women in those days.
Pretty gnarly.
Yeah. Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Also, they are not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. Also from the Jewish Talmud. Josephus is a Jewish historian who works for Rome, contemporary with these events, says, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. So in first century Judaism, very low
persona non grata,
women, right? But you might think, well, maybe that's just the Jewish culture. What about the Roman culture at large? You know, maybe they had a different, higher view of women. So this is from the Roman historian Suetonius. He writes of Caesar Augustus, who was emperor at the time of Jesus' birth, through about AD 14.
Okay.
Says, whereas men and women had hitherto always sat together, Augustus confined women to the back rows, even at gladiatorial shows, the only ones exempt from this rule being the Vestal virgins, for whom separate accommodations was provided, facing the praetor's tribunal. No women at all were allowed to witness the athletic contests. Indeed, when the audience clamored at the games for a special boxing match to celebrate his appointment as chief priest, Augustus postponed this until early the next morning and issued a proclamation to the effect that it was the chief priest's desire that women should not attend the theater before 10 o'clock. So even in the Roman world, not a very high view of women.
No exception, no wiggle room.
Right.
Okay.
And so in this world at this time, right, in both a Roman and Jewish setting, if you're going to create a story out of thin air, to just fabricate it, and you want people to believe you're, a reliable witness and that this is a credible account, you're not going to include things in that will damage the credibility of your message, of your story.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if the writers of these gospels were in kind of cahoots with one another, and they're trying to declare that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and they're going to write down these fictional accounts, they would have written them down in a way that would have been ironclad as much as it could have been. They would not have said, hey, these women found it, and to have all of them say that same story would be so opposed to what they were trying to do if they were trying to spread a rumor.
Yeah, it kind of hurts their cause. And not only is that embarrassing that women were the first witnesses of it, but it's even written in a way that makes them look bad,
Very
right?
bad, yeah.
These guys that were supposed to be benefiting from this and making all this up, here they're scared and they're hiding. And then when the women do come to them and tell them, hey, Jesus rose from the dead, they don't believe them, right? They're like, yeah, whatever. I won't believe that until I see it. And a couple of them are like, well, maybe, but I have to see for myself. I'm not taking your word for it. So the women being there, being the witnesses, is an embarrassing fact given the culture, and they're just painting themselves in a bad light. It just seems kind of unbelievable that they would make the story up and do it in that way. So this is known historically as the principle of embarrassment. If there are embarrassing features included, it kind of bolsters the reliability of the account rather than it being made up.
Okay.
So these 5 facts, that's all we're going to take, is just those 5 facts, right? These are well established historically, supported and accepted by the majority of scholars, whether favorable or skeptical towards Christianity. And so any theory regarding the resurrection of Jesus should be able to account for these facts, right?
Absolutely.
This is kind of like evidence at a crime scene.
Okay.
We come up with our theory, and it ought to be able to account for all the evidence. If it can't account for this evidence over here, then maybe it's not the best theory. Maybe there's another one that accounts for more of the evidence. So this is kind of our criteria now for judging between opposing theories.